We live in 2020, a year when there's virtually no scene that cannot be vivaciously rendered in real time on some of the most basic household hardware. Maybe the textures could be better or the frame rate could be higher, but the raw concepts themselves are pretty much unrestrained, unlike back in the day when an on-screen fight might look like two static sprites mashing into each other, or maybe a town would be rendered in blatant disproportion to your character. And despite the technological renaissance that has produced graphics that sometimes even outperform cinema, somehow I often still find myself more captivated by this. And perhaps to the surprise of many, I'm not alone in this proclivity. We're by no means a majority, but there is definitely a growing hunger for these games, hence Octopath Traveler, which was so underestimated that Square Enix actually struggled to keep the game stocked on store shelves. Now, I love Octopath, but not enough to say that it's responsible for this niche but intense demand. So what's the deal? This video will attempt to explain what it is about turn-based games that resists technological outgrowth. Why, for example, so many of us still reserve that Final Fantasy VI, a 16-bit game, remains the best of this series that's ironically known for trailblazing cinematic cutscenes in video games. An obvious theory is, of course, the rose-colored glasses of nostalgia, and I can't speak for everyone, but I can say that in this case, that certainly doesn't apply to me. My first turn-based RPG was Pokemon Red on my ice blue Game Boy Pocket. I loved that thing, but I was very young, and when I first got my hands on Pokemon, I did not get it. The turn-based system just didn't make sense to 5-year-old me. I loved the show and the toys and the cards. The cultural impact was not lost on me. I just did not have the patience in first grade to wait my turn in a single-player game. And while I played countless games throughout my childhood, I don't think I went on to experience another turn-based RPG until many years later. It wasn't until these games were already long since fermented gems that I would experience them retrospectively. So, at least for me, we can rule nostalgia out. But before I get into what it actually is, let me get ahead of a few comments. This video is not an argument that turn-based RPGs are inherently superior to action RPGs or action games in general, nor is it a case that action-based RPGs like Final Fantasy VII Remake, Witcher 3, or Skyrim should not exist. I'd never say that because I don't believe that, and there's a good chance this channel wouldn't exist if not for some of those games. Some of my all-time favorite games are action RPGs. Games come in all different shapes and sizes, with a myriad of merits and appeals, and I wouldn't have it any other way, because different people like different things for different reasons. And it's exactly this principle which brings me to my next point. There is an ever-swelling majority of gamers who believe that the merits of classic turn-based RPGs start and end with their storytelling, because once upon a time these games did have a narrative standard that was far and away higher than that of any other genre. By effect, many believe that the turn-based system and so on were simply the easiest way to shoehorn some gameplay into the mix so that the real efforts could be dedicated to the narrative. Of course, that would make the gameplay tantamount to a chore that stands between the player and the next story sequence. So what follows is that obviously, in an age when action games are telling meticulously crafted, emotionally saturated stories, we simply have no need for the archaic likes of turn-based gameplay. I think we might have fucked up somewhere. Everyone is entitled to their preferences, and if turn-based games aren't for you, that's totally understandable. But before you're qualified to write them off with any amount of objectivity, you should at least have some grasp of their merits. What I'm trying to say is that the turn-based system, the minimalistic art style, and the silent dialogue that defers to the imagination, these are not just low-caliber substitutes for lack of technological advancement. Yes, clearly the graphics are held back by technology, but these elements serve their purposes and have their own merits. They are not reducible to drawbacks of their retrospective technological limitations. Bear with me for a moment while I talk about chess. Not just because it's turn-based, even if that does speak to my point, I promise this comes back around. If you look really hard, chess is not entirely without any semblance of a narrative, albeit malleable and minimalistic. It's a vague representation of a war between two kingdoms. The pawns are like foot soldiers. They make a lesser difference on their own, but in solidarity, they can turn the tides. The rooks and bishops beam laterally and diagonally, respectively, while the knights penetrate barriers and strike from unexpected angles. Now the queen, she gets to move wherever the she wants, slaughtering all in her path. Meanwhile, the king moves one space at a time, or occasionally gets to hop a few spaces to hide behind a castle like a little Kinda seems like bullshit to me, but at any rate, the game draws its value from its thorough tactics that poise the player to think ahead and calculate their moves. Needless to say, you have to earn your victories. There's no equivalent to button mashing. You might say a story inevitably unfolds among these figurines that don't even physically resemble what they stand for, and this vague narrative aspect of the game may not be altogether pointless, but clearly it's second to the tactics. So what does this have to do with turn-based RPGs? Well, these games are like a midway point on the spectrum between chess and a full-fledged cinematic experience. You might think of it as the spectrum that exists between tactical purity and narrative production value. I don't know that these qualities inherently subtract from one another, but I'm not aware of any holy grail game that exemplifies both. Let me clarify that wherever your preference is on this broad spectrum, there's no wrong spot. As far as I'm concerned, the value is evenly distributed, although varied in form. Like chess, the subject matter of a turn-based RPG is often similarly minimalistic, but unlike chess, a lot of people don't realize that on a first glance. Some of you are going to think I'm painfully over-explaining things here, but legitimately, these are questions I've had friends ask. Are they supposed to be fighting? Why are they just standing there? Why do you get attacked every 4 steps? Why can't you see an enemy coming before they attack you? Is he a giant? Why is that guy the size of a mountain? Because like chess, these examples are not literal representations of what's happening. It's not unlike the tiles of a chessboard, which represent the battlefield symbolically. As you walk across a desert in 10 or 20 steps, that might represent 10 days worth of travel, which is why every 4 steps there's a random encounter. The character is not literally being attacked every 4 steps. It gives you mere rudiments of source material and leaves the rest to your imagination. The combat works the same way. Your characters are not literally meant to just be standing there. The distribution of turns corresponds to each combatant's relative speed, agility, dexterity, etc. It leaves the action to the proverbial theater of the mind. Whereas when action-based games attempt to account for the same attributes, they often fail. Allow me to reassure you, action RPGs mean more to me than I can express in a sentence or two. I love them, but let's be fair and acknowledge some of their recurring weaknesses. It can be easy to just exploit your surroundings in a way that makes it difficult or even impossible for a far superior enemy to even touch you by jumping onto rocks that the AI can't figure out or hiding behind a wall that the nav mesh doesn't account for. It's rare that an action-based engine properly executes the aptitude of its enemies between sludgy animations, sloppy AI,
You cover the ride. Okay.
and vague hitboxes. Not to mention the cure-all strategy that can render just about any long-term build meaningless. I call it patchpa. Pause and chug health potions. Not every action-based RPG lets you get away with this, but a lot of them do. Provided you can remember to do this, it is nearly impossible to fail once you've got a good stock of potions and aren't prone to one-hit kills. You simply can't do patchpa in a turn-based RPG, at least not in the middle of battle. Healing is bound by the turn-based system, which means if you need to heal, that's gonna cost you a turn or maybe a few, which throws your whole strategy for a loop. If a character goes down, you end up scrambling and calculating how to recover, which incentivizes a plan B or a plan C that will lead you to victory, but only by way of polished strategy. Planning out your build, assigning jobs, and managing resources are direly imperative. Obviously, you have your raw damage dealers, but you're going to need support classes that offer any number of stat buffs or other curveballs that play in your favor. A time mage might make you run circles around your opponents, doubling your turn frequency. A summoner may call in a titan to guard you, or some colossus that devours your opponent along with your very limited MP. You really have to save those attacks for when they matter. Meanwhile, a monk can't equip any weapons but gets to counter and deal massive damage back every time they take a hit. Final Fantasy V, for example, has more than 20 classes to experiment with, and each has some bizarre strategic twist. As you toy with these options, you grow your party of 4. When you work out your perfect build and it all pays off, it's extremely satisfying, like winning a game of chess. Ultimately, failure is part of the experience, and because of the legitimacy of the obstacles that you overcome, the journey feels so much more authentic and greater in scope. By effect, when these games do hit you with a story sequence, it feels like a long time coming. The characters' struggles and thereby their arcs are legitimized by your persistence and patience and hard-earned progress. Whereas in a lot of action RPGs, whatever that even means anymore, you can get by so long as you keep that one simple question in mind: did you buy enough potions? So if the whole chess-like turn-based appeal sounds good to you and you want to give it a go, I hereby offer the following suggestions just off the top of my head. If you've never played a turn-based RPG, I think the following games are great entry points: Final Fantasy IX, Pokemon Fire Red or Leaf Green, Octopath Traveler, or Earthbound. And once you've got your bearings, consider Final Fantasy V, 6, 7, or 1. Moreover, Fallout 1 and 2, Dragon Quest, Phantasy Star 4, and I obviously missed a lot of great ones because I'm just rattling these off here. So guys, help me out in the comments. Of course, the ultimate version of this appeal is probably a pen and paper campaign where the action, the story, the dialogue is all handled with the untethered capacity of the human mind. So literally anything can happen in a campaign. Even the GM can be taken by surprise. The problem is, if you've been down that road, then you probably know it's extremely hard to manage schedules and actually get a consistent group of players together to run that sort of game. And for that matter, you may just not want to deal with all the math. I'm not discouraging you from trying it, but alternatively, something like Final Fantasy may be much more limiting in form, but can be played solo on a moment's notice, and the math takes place under the hood. Anyway, if there's a turn-based gem I neglected to mention, there's a good chance I haven't played it, so I would appreciate the recommendation. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this content, consider checking out my other videos. Your like and sub would go a long way. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.